we're working through some technical issues. So Rick is here in spirit, and hopefully we'll be here in reality shortly. But we're really excited to have Sebastian along. Some of you may know him. He started helping out on the Band of Brothers tours 2017.
Yes.
He was working on his master's program, and he wanted to study kind of how Americans remember the war and how they interpret their experience. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But more importantly, I think this week it's very important, is Sebastian is chairman of the Faces of Margraten program, which you may have heard about. It's a really wonderful program that literally starts to put a picture with a face when you go to the cemetery. I think it's very moving, and we want Sebastian to talk a little bit about this, since it's supposed to be going on right now, right?
It was, yeah. So the Faces of Margraten is a project that we started for the 70th anniversary of World War II, so which was 5 years ago. And the idea is, like you said, very simple: put literally a face to a name. We see a picture on the screen. One of the soldiers buried there. There are over 8,000 soldiers, American soldiers, buried in Margraten. It's such a different experience seeing that face next to the stone, and it makes it much more, how to put it, I guess, real. Some people have sort of said, it brings those people back to life, and I think that's very powerful. Instead of connecting to a stone, you're connecting to an actual person, a human being. You can look into his eyes or her. We also have 4 women buried in Margraten. So yeah, that's the idea that started 5 years ago. We had then just over 3,000 pictures. And this year, actually, yesterday would have been the first day of the 4th time that we would have the photos on display. We were hoping, or we would have had more than 7,500 photos on display. So that's 75% of all soldiers buried there or memorialized as missing. And there's Rick. Speaking of missing.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Wow.
at least to me.
Amazing.
So that's very, in a few words, the Faces of Margraten, putting a face to a soldier's name. And yeah.
So Sebastian, I mean, a lot of our guests have been to Margraten with various tours, but Margraten's always struck me as unique, probably because of the grave adoption program, and it's kind of spread from there. And for people who might not know, what's a little bit of background about Margraten, and why is the cemetery there, and what is it? And
so Margraten is one of the 26 overseas American war cemeteries, all maintained, by the way, by the United States government. And Margraten is a cemetery that was constructed 49th U.S. Army, reasoning, okay, we're gonna cross the German border very soon, so we probably need a cemetery to bury our dead. The United States was very particular about not wanting to have any of their soldiers buried in enemy soil. So Margraten would be the cemetery where the soldiers killed in Germany would be brought to. So in total, over 18,000 Americans were buried just after the war in that cemetery. Later on, families were given the option to say, okay, I want to have my relatives still buried in Margraten or be brought back home to the United States. So ultimately, there are 8,000 soldiers there, 8,300 soldiers buried in Margraten, 1,700 missing soldiers memorialized. And you just mentioned it, the Adopt a Grave program that started pretty much already in 1945. You just have to imagine that some of the soldiers buried in Margraten were actually quartered in the houses of people around Margraten. The city of Maastricht is very close to Margraten. It was a rest and recreation center during the war. So we still get stories of people who actually knew the soldiers buried there in the cemetery. And so it then makes total sense that people felt like, knowing that that soldier had died, that it would go to Margraten and bring flowers. And quite quickly after the war, the idea started to adopt all graves buried there, of all graves in that cemetery. And that program is still going on to this day, even though about 60% of all bodies were brought back to the United States. But today there is I believe what I heard, a waiting list of more than 900 people wanting to adopt a grave in Margraten, or a name on the walls of the missing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Sebastian, I understand that some of the adopt a grave, it's passed down to different members of the family.
So I can still not hear you, Rick. So I
Can
can't.
you hear me, Sebastian?
I hear you.
So Rick had asked about, is it true that the graves are passed down in families? That kind of
Yeah.
continues along?
Actually, I actually had an email today about a soldier buried in Margraten, and the woman wrote, "Oh yeah, my mother, she knew that soldier. He was quartered in her house in 1944, I think. 94, yeah. So around December." And now I'm the one who has adopted the grave, and that's a very common story that people started to adopt a grave in 1945, and then it just goes down in the family. The grandmother passes away, for example, she hands it over to her child, and then it's passed on again. So you get like the third or fourth generation now. Sometimes is still looking over the same grave as in 1945.
Do you think that will continue?
Well, like I said, there is a waiting list of 900 people. So even though we're now, celebrating 75th anniversary, there obviously still is a big, big interest in this history, and there is still an enormous gratitude for these soldiers. Right now, all American cemeteries are closed because of the pandemic, but still. If you would be on Facebook groups about the cemetery, you would see people all over posting pictures of the soldiers. They've printed the photos of the soldiers and put them on their windows at home, so that everyone can see, guys, we have not forgotten these soldiers. And again, this is not just people who have lived through the war. It's really also, like I said, third or fourth generations, and sometimes even people like myself who didn't have any relatives who adopted a grave, which is who started later on getting involved in the cemetery. So yeah, like I said, it's very much still alive today.
So given what you just said, how did you kind of come to this, and then what led to this idea? I mean, it's a pretty big project.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, actually, my whole interest started with a book by the very famous Stephen Ambrose back in the day, From D-Day to Berlin. I think that was the first non-fictional book I read about World War II. I went on the internet, started to read more about war history, and then learned about Margraten and the possibility to adopt a grave. That's how it started for me. And then with other people, we started to do research on a lot of soldiers, put up a database that's today the Fields of Honor database with over 30,000 soldiers in it. And I still call it like a random Sunday morning thought. With the 70th anniversary approaching of World War II, we wanted to do something offline. I mean, the database is nice online, but it's different than being on the cemetery. And that's when the idea of the Faces of Margraten came about, thinking, okay, we give those soldiers a face online, but why not where it really matters,
Right.
at the cemetery? And that's how it started 5 years ago.
So have you been surprised with how the direction it's gone and how it's taken off, or did you kind of?
Yeah. When you think of a project, you start, and then you have to just see how people respond to it, for example. And nobody knew what the impact would be of a small photo, because that's what it is. It's like 10 by 10 centimeters. This is a very small photo, but we had so many people coming off the cemetery emotional just by looking at a photo, and also young people sort of saying, oh, I could have been this guy if I had lived in a different time. And that's the very powerful effect. And we have seen in the past 2 years, lots of Americans who don't have any connection to the cemetery spending so much time of their spare time on finding the faces that we're still missing. Just because they want to be involved and also say thanks to these soldiers and make sure they're not forgotten. They spend hours to pretty much research their whole state, their home state, to find pictures. And that's also really, we have our own volunteers who do a lot of work, but also because so many people in the United States have joined us in doing research and helping us to get to those 7,500 pictures.
Do you know, has there been any thought or talk about doing a similar thing at other cemeteries, or is...
Yeah, actually, we have seen, for example, the Faces of Cambridge and the Faces of Epinal. Cambridge obviously is in England, and a lot of Air Force soldiers are buried there. Epinal is in eastern France. So yeah, we actually do see different groups taking on that idea of, this. But again, I think it's a very simple but powerful idea, just by putting that face next to a grave and being able to connect to the person buried there.
So it must. I mean, you're just starting out in history, right? You're beginning your career in this. I mean, it must be pretty good to know that you've already made such a big impact.
Yeah. I don't know. It's I'm not sure if I always think about impact, but yeah, I get, yeah, like I said, I know it's very powerful, people, and I think like the grave adopters, I think they have a very powerful bond anyway to these soldiers. But what I really like to see that during the faces, there are also a lot of other people who normally don't go to the cemetery,
Right.
who have not adopted a grave, and they go there and then realize, wow, here are 10,000 soldiers either buried or memorialized as missing, who have done so much for our freedom, and that's what hits them when they come there, maybe sometimes even for the first time, if you talk to people that have never been there before. And I think that is very valuable, that we are able to introduce new people to this history, and in particular to the people that were part of it.
Well, are there I mean, there's a story to every grave there, but are there any stories in particular that kind of grab you or strike you, or is it, are just too many? Or,
well, that's definitely true.
Don't want to put you on the spot, but I know.
Yeah, I know. It's just one story I recently wrote down was about a soldier, and it mainly focuses on his parents, actually. His father was a Pulitzer Prize winner, and partly why he won the prize was because of the travels he made after his son's death. He went on a trip through the United States together with his wife, to sort of cope with that loss, and well, that led to some books he wrote. But the thing is, for a long time, they were not sure whether he still was alive. So you see two parents who are very desperate for any answers. What they had was a Nazi flag that their son had sent home, and it was signed by his fellow soldiers. So what they did, they tried to reach out to all those soldiers that had their names on the flag, just hoping to find anything out about what happened to their son. Because what had happened to him, he had fallen off a boat during when they retreated from a patrol. The last time he was seen, he was still alive, hanging on to that boat. And because that was the last eyewitness who had seen that, they could not declare him dead. There was no body. So the parents were just like, what happened to him? And nobody could really give them any answers. So you just, when you read the files, you just see that desperation, you just feel it. Yeah, I think that always very much brings home the impact of
Yeah.
war on a very personal level.
Yeah, it
like
always.
that.
I mean,
You know,
it
no,
always is hard for me
no.
when I'm there with the tours because I talk about the Band of Brothers guys because they're, that's what we have a lot of time for. But I always wonder, all those crosses have a story, and so I know people always ask me about what happened at these crosses, and kind of leading into that, you guys are working on a book or have a book now about the program and some of the faces.
Yeah. For many reasons, the faces are only on display for 5 days every 2 years. So with the 75th anniversary, we really wanted to have something more permanent. I mean, the Dutch have tomorrow their Memorial Day. Tomorrow is May 4th, which is the day on which the Netherlands commemorate all the war dead. But it's, then it doesn't have to stop after that. I mean, you don't only have to remember on May 4. So that's why we put together a book with close to 200 stories of the soldiers buried in Margraten, even more faces, and a list, there it is, and a list with all the names. So there are 10,000 names in that book, over 70 pages, just names of all the soldiers buried there. Yeah.
And you were saying that you're trying to work out a way to get that published in English over here, right?
Yes. Unless someone wants to
Is
learn
anybody
Dutch,
out there listening?
yeah, I think that's a great way. Just translate it word by word. But yeah, we definitely hope to also have it published in Dutch later this. In Dutch, it's already in Dutch. In English, later this year. Because ultimately these stories are also about the relatives back at home in the United States, so it feels kind of odd to only have these stories in Dutch available. So yeah, we're hoping we can work that out and make it available in English later this year. Yeah.
Okay. So I know a couple questions that we've been getting. One is from Cassidy, who's a young person who's was on one of my trips and got very involved in remembering the Band of Brothers. But she was curious if you had thoughts or recommendations about getting younger people involved, because I mean, old folks like me, I knew the veterans, right? So that is my connection. But as we get 75 years ago, how do you make that connection, and how do you kind of continue this on?
Well, I think what I see in the Netherlands, what happens is the Netherlands didn't have World War One, so
Right.
that's completely different from Belgium and France. For us, World War Two is the war. If you talk about the war, it's World War Two.
Right.
So it's widely taught in school. Like tomorrow, May 4, you cannot miss it. Surveys show that more than 90% of all people will observe 2 minutes of silence tomorrow at 8 p.m. So I think a lot of people here in the Netherlands grow up with the history of World War II, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they, of course, are like us deeply into it.
Yeah, sure.
I think they have to be, but I see a lot of young people at commemorations because the parents bring them or because they come themselves. If you go to a military event, you will see a lot of young people. If I look at our own foundation, I mean, I'm 27, but we have people younger than me and just slightly older than me. So personally, I'm not that concerned that there is a lack of interest. But yeah, you can tell that personal stories, definitely help to, like the Band of Brothers, of course, which is for many people, like Saving Private Ryan, the story with which their interest started. So you see how powerful that can be.
Do you know? I mean, one of the other questions we got: have they used your project at all in schools, or have they, or does it happen? Does it get out beyond the cemetery, or?
Well, the funny thing is, one of the reasons that the book is out is because one of the other people working on it is Jordi is his name. He is a history teacher in high school. So he actually started to write down the stories to be able to share them with his students. And then what he did, he would assign a soldier to them, and they would research that soldier. They would sometimes travel to the cemetery to actually visit the grave, even though it wasn't part of the assignment. So yeah, actually a school in Margraten is named after Maurice Rose, the highest ranking soldier in the cemetery. He was a general of, I think the last unit was the 2nd Armored Division. I believe there was this. So yeah, and the school has adopted his grave, or at least goes once every year to the cemetery to put flowers on his grave. So there are different ways indeed that Margraten is not always specifically, of course, the Faces of Margraten, but definitely Margraten itself is definitely some kind of way for schools close by.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a chance to brag up the Dutch here a little bit before I do. I got a question from Nancy, and she'd like to know a little bit more about, if you know, the 4 women buried in the cemetery, and she'd also like to know why is it that there are so few women buried in the American cemeteries. If you have any thoughts or opinions on that.
The second question is more difficult. So there are 4 women buried in the cemetery. 2 were civilians and 2 were Red Cross. Well, one was Red Cross, I should say. So we have 2 flight nurses. There were evacuation. I'm not sure flying. Well, the flight nurses. So what they did, they would, go to the front by plane, pick up wounded soldiers, and bring them back. We have, for example, one of them volunteered to go on a flight, and she was close to her last flight, and then the plane went down in storm. So we have someone there. We have another one. She was part of the Red Cross donut canteen. So they had captured a German plane, and she and a sister were invited to go on a little flight with that plane. First the sister, she came back safe, and then the plane crashed on the next flight with the other sister, with her sister. So one was killed in a car accident, and the other one is a flight nurse as well. So yeah, speaking of accidents, there's a lot of soldiers also in Margraten, and we were simply killed in a vehicle accident, or we have seen people drowning, or I once was working on a story of a soldier who was heating up water, boiling water, and then the whole thing exploded, and that's how he died. So that's also a thing to keep in mind while visiting these cemeteries. There's also a lot of these sad stories of even people who had survived the war and then still died, ammunition explosions, you name it, which is only even sadder thinking you have made it through and then still ending up in Margraten.
Well, Nancy, I just want to add, part of the reason you see so few women in the U.S. cemeteries is just given the nature of the military at that time. They weren't in positions where they were under fire or in the front line. They were still contributing massively. They've done a whole huge effort just to be able to deploy to a combat zone. So it wasn't for lack of trying, but there were just fewer of them there when the shell started to fall. And I know at Margraten and some of the other cemeteries, the women that are buried there are, like you said, accidents, or they'd worked for the Red Cross, or sickness, or what have you. It's just kind of a reflection of what the military was at that time. But we'll try to maybe do a piece on women in World War II and women in the military. But I wanted to get back to.
Can you guys, either of you guys hear me?
I can. I
can't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay, so that's a start. And I'm up on the feed. I think everybody who's watching. I've been told that some of the people watching could hear me. We're having some amazing technical happenstances with this. Can I jump? I know now you've gotten so used to hosting the show by yourself, Chris, that I probably will have a hard time finding my way back in.
Rick, but before you continue, we've already talked about the Ghost Army, so you might not want to.
I've been listening the entire time, Chris. So, but what I was, and I saw that, by the way, we didn't advertise. I saw that Sebastian had a great looking cocktail there. What are you drinking, Sebastian?
I just made a espresso martini, which is really my favorite.
They're classier over there than we are. I've just got a beer.
We use glasses where I come from. I'm drinking wine, as I just showed people, but you can't see it, Chris. Yeah.
But is a beer a real cocktail?
Well, you know.
Beer and wine are
in these trying times that we're living in. Yeah.
Oh, obviously your English isn't quite up to par, Sebastian. Of course they are.
I guess that's it. Yeah.
Wrong. So I wanted to ask you, because you were talking earlier about the Adopt a Grave program. You have a grave that you've adopted yourself, and I wondered when you had done that, who that is, why, and then what are your responsibilities as a grave adopter at the Margraten Cemetery?
Right. So it was really in the beginning of my interest in World War II that I adopted a grave in Margraten. So you apply for the program, and then they assign you a grave, and I got the grave assigned of Lawrence Francis Shea. He was a soldier from Brooklyn, New York. Obviously, you can tell from his name, with Irish roots. And he was a corporal in the 318th Infantry Regiment 80 Division. That was not his first assignment. He's been for quite a long time in the Army Air Forces back in the United States. But I think that when casualties mounted in the Army, he was transferred to the infantry, and there he joined by the end of March 1945. He joined the 80 Division. And there he spent, say maybe 7 to 10 days. And then he was killed near the German city of Kassel, a very big industrial city. And it's likely believed that he was killed during a counterattack by the German troops, about 200 soldiers and a couple of Tiger tanks. His death report says that he was hit by a shell, so probably he has been hit by one of those tanks, meaning ultimately that he died on the age of 21. Yeah. And so, and you asked us about what does it mean to adopt a grave. So, like I said before, all cemeteries are maintained by the American government, so they do all the maintenance work. Adoption really means that you honor that soldier. So you go visit his grave, if you can, a couple of times a year. You bring flowers. Some people will also really actively try to learn more about the soldier's history. Do research, try to find files in the military archives. And there's a lot of connections to the family members in the United States. A lot of grave adopters have connections, or have contact, I should say, with the families back in the United States, and sometimes since 1945. And again, the same that a grave would be passed on in a family. first parents corresponded, then the sisters or the brothers of a soldier will correspond with the remaining family, and then that's how it goes down. And so a grave might pass on, but it's definitely also the friendship that has emerged from that grave adoption that will last for, in many cases, for decades now.
Well, I was I had mentioned on my trips, obviously it's an awful thing to have to bring people together, but if there is a silver lining to this whole thing, is the relationships that have grown out of it and the people that have become friends. And I've always found it very moving.
Yeah, I think a few years ago, a real historian, so not me, did a book on the grave adoption program, and it's called The Margraten Boys, and it's called that way because many people consider those soldiers to be their boys, like as if it was their own kid buried there. And I guess that's also why it's not too surprising that you will see, like I said, all those photos put out on windows or in a frame at home, because the soldiers really become part of those adopting families.
It would certainly be great to see that continued at other American cemeteries in Europe, and I hope that, maybe that's an example that if it gets around enough and people learn about it enough, that other cemeteries, other superintendents, ABMC, or other local people in, Luxembourg or France or elsewhere will want to do that. If there's somebody who's watching, actually, I'm going to pause that question for a moment and go back. We did get a question from somebody who was on one of your trips, Barry Eggleston. And he wanted to know, so you were talking about how the Netherlands celebrates May 4th as Remembrance Day, May 5th as Liberation Freedom Day. And of course, that's not happening this year.
Yeah.
But he wanted to know, how does a typical Dutch town celebrate or commemorate those events?
Well, May 4th, pretty much so May 4th is what you would call Memorial Day. Just we have it early in the month. And pretty much every Dutch town has some kind of war memorial. That might be to the local citizens that were killed in a town, or because of a particular bomber came down, an Allied bomber came down. So pretty much every town has some kind of memorial, and that's where I think really every town pretty much has its own little Memorial Day ceremony, and observes the 2 minutes of silence at 8 p.m. That's really a national moment. Trains will stop. People will put down, pull their cars aside on the roads, in all kinds of ways. So people will lower the flags, and then in Amsterdam is really the national point of commemoration. So about 20,000 people will go there to the National Monument. We'll have speeches, flowers, and tomorrow is of course going to be very different because of all the, because of the whole situation. And tomorrow we have a empty square in Amsterdam with almost nobody there, and only one of the few people to be there is the king, and he will address the nation tomorrow on this anniversary, 75th anniversary. So that's what's going to happen on the 4th tomorrow. Normally, the 5th of May is a lot of fun activities. That was the actual day that the Netherlands was liberated in 1945. So you will normally have festivals and markets and what have you not. The flag will be out again. But yeah, different times. A lot had been planned for this special anniversary, but a lot of it is going to be at home.
Sure.
Yeah,
We do the same in London. I know they were having lots and lots of plans for events in London, which of course have now been canceled. The Queen will give an address. We'll have a couple of minutes of silence across the country, and they're encouraging everybody at 8 o'clock. I don't know you guys have heard, but every Thursday night, everybody opens their window and claps for the NHS. So on VE Day, we're all supposed to open our windows and sing "We'll Meet Again." Now, I might just listen. But
I have seen that. There's small scale stuff here in the Netherlands as well, like a clap for the liberators, or indeed sing. Yeah, that's on the May 5th. Actually, I've seen that in my own hometown or city, to all sing together. What we'll have tomorrow as well. They hope that as many people as possible will play our version of The Last Post just before 8 p.m. so that everyone who plays some kind of horn or whatever, trumpet, whoever can do it, will play it together, and then observe the moments of silence.
So Sebastian, since I can't see Rick, I don't know if he's trying to butt in, so I beat him to the punch.
I see him.
Oh, okay. So, I've been going to Europe doing battlefield tours for 30 plus years. And obviously it's remembered, and people are very appreciative. They remember the vets, they remember the sacrifices, but the Netherlands are different. You guys take it to a level, I think, far beyond, say, the French or the Belgians. Here's your chance give a plug for the Netherlands Tourist Board. But why do you think it is? Why is it so much more in your country than, say, Belgium? Or different? I shouldn't say more, maybe different.
Yeah, because the Netherlands doesn't pay any attention pretty much to World War One. That's it has happened, but yeah, we don't. Like on the 11th of November, there's no any kind of ceremony or whatever. So again, I really think it's the thing that for us, World War II was the big war that we all remember. That's really the only reason I can think of that. For us, it's really a touchstone to talk about war and also about freedom. There's really, I think, if you listen in to many ceremonies or whatever, there's always this very strong message, that says this should never happen again. And I think people really put emphasis on that, and I think that's why there is so much attention still for it, because it's not just about history for many people. It's really about also thinking about today and what does freedom mean, and that I guess that will give it continuous relevance. If you're able to make a bridge to today, or at least in people's own minds, then it's much more than a history, and that makes it relevant, I guess. It's still relevant, and that's what you see. Actually, that's an interesting thing I found. May 4th, they do a survey about what does freedom mean and who do you commemorate. The largest chunk of Dutch people does not simply look at World War II. For them, it's thinking about all people, all casualties of all wars, and not just World War II anymore. So you see a shift. We're shifting sort of away, at least people are shifting away from just thinking about World War II and taking it much further than that. Yeah.
Sebastian, if butting in, Chris.
Please do.
Okay, Chris can't hear me. We're having a delightful technical day, and I hope I look calm because I don't feel calm. But Sebastian, if there are people watching, and we sure hope there are, who want to help, who want to do some research, who want to dig in and find the photos of some of the soldiers who are at the Margraten cemetery, how do they connect with the project? How do they get names of somebody who's not already, there's already a photograph of, and how do they dig into that?
Yeah, so one of our volunteers actually made on Google Maps a map showing where all the soldiers without a photo came from. So someone can go to that map on our website, facesofmargraten.com, and then click on the map, zoom in on that map wherever they want to zoom into, be it their hometown or their state, and they can just click at all the points on the map, and then it says, John Smith was from here, we're looking for a photo, and just name it. So that's definitely a way that people can find out which faces we're still looking for, and then it really becomes a matter of trying to use every source available, newspapers, libraries, sometimes the American Legion. Recently, we got a photo that was found in a newspaper because the particular guy had got a speeding ticket, and the newspaper published all the soldiers or all the people who got a speeding ticket in a town, and that's how we got the photo. So you never know where to find a photo. It might also be at a Waffle House. That's where I once found a
Waffle
photo,
House?
because at a Waffle House, because they had this big wall with all soldiers from the community, and there was a photo.
Wow.
So you never know where to find it. It takes a little bit of persistence sometimes, especially, the more you get, the harder it will be to find the remaining ones. But yeah, it's really what we need. There's so much you can find on the internet, and luckily more and more archives become digitally available. But it's also really a matter of having boots on the ground. At some point, people making calls, visiting that library, visiting a school that might have a memorial to a soldier. Yeah.
So the plan, though, is to keep the project going, right? It's just because of what's happened this year. It's not you're going to do it again with the pictures and.
Yeah, we're aiming now for next year. So our goal was 7,500 faces for the 75th anniversary. We made that, so I think going for 8,000 is a new goal, and see if we can get there or even go over the goal.
Yeah.
Sebastian, there's a question. Ted Moon asks about. I'm sorry, not Ted Moon, but we had someone who asked about Andy Clevenger asked about the Voices of Margraten, and is that a separate project? Is that a real thing? What's the story on that?
Yeah, so I always like to say, like, a picture paints 1,000 words, but it doesn't tell the full story. So 2 years ago, we made, together with another foundation, 4 audio tours. And in those audio tours, soldiers would tell their own stories, and it's called Voices from Margraten. So that was launched during the Faces of Margraten of 2018. That ran for a year, and now it's not online anymore. But we're definitely hoping to bring it back. It was also the plan for this year, but of course we had to postpone. The Faces of Margraten, and I know why Andy is asking, because his son did a tremendous job playing, being the voice actor for one of the characters of one of the tours. But we hope to have it back next year.
Fantastic. So I don't know if we really mentioned Chris, but maybe we should mention that Sebastian is really a terrific historian in his own right.
Absolutely.
What he's doing, and he has a book that's available as an ebook on Amazon called "War is Hell, but Damned Exciting," which is based on his thesis. And anybody who's written a thesis, I think, deserves congratulations, because I certainly never have. And so I've given it away. Oh my God. So Sebastian, can you tell us, this book is about sort of how World War II is remembered, I think, if I read the small type correctly. Can you tell us just in a few words a little bit about this book before we wrap up?
Yeah, so for me as a youngster, if I can still call myself that, I grew up.
Around us, yes, you can.
Yes, absolutely.
That we should learn from this history, and working on projects like the Faces of Margraten. I have always wondered whether we can really learn from World War II. So I did my degree in American Studies, and I decided to ask that question: can we learn from engaging with the history of World War II? And what I did, I talked to a lot of guests of the Band of Brothers tours. I spoke to a lot of people in the field of remembrance, be it like a museum director or some tour guides,
Any
historians.
tour guides we know or can gossip about?
The prettiest one, called Evan Himmel. Then we also had Chris Anderson, but
now you're
so yeah, and then really, look at, how do people engage at sites with the history, and talk later to them about what they have taken away. And really using the Band of Brothers, which is, I think, for many people, the reason why their interest started. How is war represented? How do we engage, and what do we take away from it? I think those were the three main questions I tried to find an answer to in the thesis and now in the book.
Well, I'll order a copy. I haven't read it yet, but I want to make sure that I read it, so anything I don't like, I can give you a hard time about. That's the main reason. And who knows, I might learn something. Something might penetrate my thick skull. But Chris, do you have anything else you want to ask Sebastian about?
No, I just want to. I wanted to confirm that we're going to be doing Faces of Margraten again next year, Lord willing, and you're going to keep it up. And we're just thrilled to death that you came on the show, but more importantly, what you've done with the Faces project. Because,
absolutely, thank you very much for.
It really is tremendous, and everybody I know that talks to me about it is very moved by it. So thank you.
So we want to thank Sebastiaan Vonk for coming on our show, and we're not quite done yet. We have something coming we want to tell you about after Sebastian, so don't go away yet. But we want to thank Sebastian for coming on and braving our technical difficulties. He didn't even have to reach for a second cocktail, so I guess it wasn't that bad. And thank you, Sebastian, for everything that you're doing as well, and your work. And I think both Chris and I look forward to seeing you somewhere in Europe next year doing something.
Maybe this year. Hopefully.
Hoping this year. So we'll see how it goes. So Sebastiaan Vonk, thank you so much. And
Thanks, guys.
And Sebastian, post the website in the comments section here, the website, and maybe the page with the YouTube videos. Post some of that up in the comments so people can find it.
Yeah.
Okay. Sebastian, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Chris, you can still not see me, but you can still hear me, right?
Correct.
Awesome. Well, it's the best of all worlds for you. And so I wanted to give you a moment to talk about something that's come up in the last week or so that's kind of an important thing, and trying to support something that is having some difficulties. So why don't you take it away there?
Okay. I know a lot of you who have checked into my Facebook post have gotten an announcement about this, but like many of us that are affected with this virus and the lockdown, life's kind of changed. And amongst my friends who've been going through some tough times are the people down in Toccoa, Georgia. So for those of you who've been with me on the Band of Brothers trip, you know that there's some wonderful folks down there that voluntarily keep a museum up and running to educate people about what the paratroopers did, what Easy Company did, 506, all the units that trained at Camp Toccoa. You know that it's a totally voluntary organization, and they house the stables building from All Aboard England, which I think you can see a picture of now. To be perfectly blunt, if it wasn't for them, that building there, that historic building, would have been matchwood. But they just continue to work, and because of the restrictions, the travel restrictions, the lockdown, and the isolation, they are not getting any visitors coming through the front doors anymore. And without visitors, they can't stay open. So they have laid off their paid staff. They have volunteers that are coming in to make sure everything stays safe, the artifacts stay safe, but they're having a real hard time. And they're looking for help, and they're looking for involvement. So if by any chance you are in a position to help out, they would really appreciate it. If you would like a concrete thing to take away, shop in their gift shop and buy a Camp Toccoa t-shirt, join as a member, but just call and thank them and let them know you're there and you're thinking about them and you're going to help them get through all this, because they've done a lot to help us out over the years. So.
And we've put that contact information on the screen. It's scrolling below us. We'll leave it up for the rest of the show, and please try to help out. There's so many museums. We were talking to Sebastian a few days ago, preparing for this broadcast. He was telling us about museums in the Netherlands that are having a hard time.
Yeah.
This is a great time, I would suggest, for people to consider getting a membership in a museum that you like. Maybe you're not going to be able to get a membership right away, but they can sure use that support to try to stay open for when the day comes that you can use that membership. And that seems really important.
Yeah, I would say, obviously I have a bias towards Toccoa. It's special to me, but there are so many of these small museums, historical societies, historic sites all over the place. I'm sure there's one near you that do a lot of good work with not a lot in the way of resources, and they could really use your help right now. So find your local historical society and give them a hand.
And last but not least on our show today, we want to talk to you about our show next week, by which time we will have solved, I guarantee, all technical problems. They will not appear again. Next week, by coincidence, our show falls on May 10th, which is the 80th anniversary of the day that Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of England. It's sort of also the day that Hitler invaded France, so it's a pretty major day in history. And to commemorate that, we have a pretty major historian on. Chris, tell us who we've got.
Andrew Roberts, who is a prolific author, has written countless books about the war. But his biography of Churchill, Walking with Destiny, is the latest. It's rightly regarded here in England as now the definitive account of Churchill and his whole life. And we are over the moon excited about this, and also kind of a little starstruck. But it should be a tremendous opportunity. Usually when he makes public appearances, you're lucky to see your hand raised at the back of the room, but he's agreed to come on the show. So please send us your questions and tune in, and you'll get a chance to ask probably the world's foremost Churchill biographer live today. Any questions you might have about the great man.
Yeah, and a terrific historian, even apart from the Churchill book. I mean, Master and Commanders is a good book. Not Masters and Commanders, that's the novel, but the what's his book? The Commanders, I guess. Andrew Roberts, his many, I think 19 or 23, some huge number of books that he's written or translated or edited. He's been on the BBC many times, so we're really excited to be talking to him about Churchill, and that is 1 week from tonight. And I do want to say a couple of people have asked after I made my comment, what about our tour in August or September? Honestly, I don't have any information about that. We're all waiting to see what happens in the next few weeks, and so you'd have to check in with the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours office about that. As Chris said, our fingers are crossed that we will be doing tours later this year. but there's just no real way to know at the moment. So, Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
We overcame, we improvised, we adapted, we overcame, and it was a great show with Sebastian, who's I know still listening to us, so don't say anything bad about him. And we really look forward to Andrew Roberts next week. And thank you, everybody, for coming and for bearing with us through our technical difficulties. We appreciate it. And we'll see you next Sunday, because we'll be here.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Stay safe, everybody.
Cheers.